She had 6 minutes before the doors to the most important exam of her life locked forever, and she was going to make it. Sera Voss had been awake since 4 that morning, not from nerves, but because that was simply who she was. The kind of person who takes things seriously. The kind of person who earns everything twice because the world never handed her anything once. For 3 years, this young woman had eaten ramen 4 nights a week. She worked double shifts on weekends in a hospital laundry room, washing other people's scrubs while dreaming about wearing her own. She studied under a single lamp in an apartment so small her textbooks had their own corner of the floor like a second roommate. 3 years. For this one morning. She left her apartment on Fenwick Road at 7:42, exam folder pressed against her chest, stethoscope coiled in her bag like a promise she had made to herself a long time ago. But here is what you need to understand about Sera, before we go any further. This was never about a career for her. When Sera was 19 years old, she watched her younger brother Tobias get admitted to a hospital for the 3rd time before his 8th birthday. She stood in that corridor with her mother, both of them with empty hands and no answers, watching strangers in scrubs do the work that needed doing while they could only wait. That was the day Sera decided she would never be the person standing helplessly at the edge of someone else's crisis again. Nursing was not ambition. It was a debt she was paying to the universe. She turned onto Calloway Street at 7:59, and that was when she heard it. Not a scream. Something quieter than a scream, and somehow worse, a soft collapsing sound. The kind of sound a body makes when it has stopped negotiating with gravity and simply surrendered. Sera stopped walking. 20 feet ahead of her, an elderly woman lay on the pavement, silver hair, a dove-gray blazer, one hand stretched toward the ground as though reaching for something she had dropped. A black luxury vehicle sat at the curb, door hanging open, engine still running, as though whoever had been inside had left in a terrible hurry. There was no one else on the street. Sera looked at her watch, 7:59. She looked at the woman, she looked at her watch again. 3 years of her life sat on one side of an invisible scale. A woman turning gray on cold asphalt sat on the other. Sera dropped her folder, and she ran. Now I need to stop right here for just a second because I want you to really think about what Sera just did. She did not hesitate because she was brave. She hesitated because she was human. She looked at that watch. She did the math. She knew exactly what staying meant, and she stayed anyway. Here is my question for you, and I genuinely want to know your answer in the comments below. If that was you on that pavement, would you have stopped? Would you have traded 3 years of sacrifice for a stranger you had never met and would probably never see again? Tell me, life or the dream? Because what Sera did not know, what she could not have known, is that the woman lying on that pavement was about to connect her to the most feared man in the entire city, and he was already on his way. If you want to find out what happens when Sera comes face to face with him, and trust me, that moment will make your jaw drop, subscribe right now and stay with me. You are going to want to see this through to the end. Sera moved like someone who had been rehearsing for exactly this moment for 3 years. Gloves on before she reached the woman, stethoscope already in her hand. She did not panic. She did not freeze. She assessed. Airway, breathing, pulse. The woman's lips had gone gray. Her chest was barely moving. Her pulse, when Sera found it, was so faint it felt less like a heartbeat and more like a rumor of one. Sera began working, and while her hands moved, her mind stayed sharp enough to notice details that had nothing to do with the medical emergency in front of her. The woman's blazer was expensive, the kind of quality you can feel before you see. Her shoes were handmade. The pearl earring pressed against the cold pavement was real. And her hands, the hands stretched out on the asphalt were calloused in the way of someone who spends serious time in a garden. Not a pampered woman, a working one. A woman with a life. A full, specific, still ongoing life that was currently running out of time on a public street. Sera pressed harder. She heard them before she saw them. 2 figures in dark suits appeared at the far end of Calloway Street running, not the casual jog of concerned bystanders, the controlled, deliberate run of men who have been trained to move fast without looking panicked. And behind them, a 3rd figure, taller than the other 2, moving differently, not running at all, in fact, striding. covering ground with the kind of controlled urgency that suggests a man who refuses to let even a crisis make him look hurried. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in a black suit, the collar of his shirt open at the throat. Even from a distance, Sera could see the dark lines of tattoos climbing the side of his neck. His face, even at this distance, was hard in a way that had nothing to do with anger. It was the face of someone who has made difficult decisions so many times that the difficulty no longer registers, refined by pressure into something that no longer bent easily. Sera registered all of this in approximately 1 second. Then she went back to work. Because the woman on the pavement had about 90 seconds left in her 6-minute window, and the man striding down Calloway Street, whoever he was going to have to wait. Get away from her. Here is something you need to understand about Dorian Vael. This was a man whose name made other powerful people uncomfortable, not afraid, uncomfortable. The specific discomfort of people who understand that someone in the room operates by rules they cannot fully see or predict. He had built something vast and invisible in the city. Not a business, not exactly, more like a system of pressures, financial, social, structural, that kept certain things moving and certain other things very, very still. Judges did not rule against his interests. Contracts did not fall through. Problems had a way of resolving themselves before they became visible. He had 3 rules about his mother. She was never to be left without protection. She was never to be taken to a public medical facility. And she was never, under any circumstance, to be seen as vulnerable by anyone outside the family. All 3 rules were currently being broken in broad daylight on Calloway Street. Dorian reached the scene in 11 seconds from where his car had stopped. His 2 men were already there, flanking this situation, waiting for his instruction. He looked down at the young woman in blue scrubs kneeling over his mother, a stranger, hands moving across his mother's chest with clinical precision, gloves already on, stethoscope already deployed, working with the focused efficiency of someone who had not yet looked up once since he arrived. Move away from her. His voice came out exactly the way it always did, level, weighted, the kind of voice that does not need volume to carry authority. Every person who had ever worked for him, negotiated with him, or made the mistake of crossing him knew that voice. It was the voice that ended conversations. Sera Voss did not look up. "She's in cardiac arrest," she said. "I need 30 more seconds." Dorian took 1 step forward. "I said move." "And I said 30 seconds." Her hands did not stop. Her voice did not shake. She was not performing courage. She genuinely did not have bandwidth for his authority right now. There was a woman dying under her hands, and everything else was noise. "If you pull me away from her right now," Sera said, still not looking up, "she will die on this street. Is that what you want?" Nobody spoke to Dorian Vael like that. Nobody. His hand, raised to signal his men, is stopped in midair. And here is the thing that nobody on that street would ever fully understand, because nobody on that street except Dorian knew what it cost him. This man who controlled the architecture of an entire city. This man who had not asked anyone for anything in 30 years. This man who had built his entire existence around the principle that vulnerability was a door you kept locked at all times. He lowered his hand. He did not move her, because she was right. And he knew she was right. And knowing she was right while having no power to do anything but stand there and wait was the single most devastating experience of his adult life. Renata Vael drew a breath, ragged, shallow, barely there, but there. Dorian's hand found the wall beside him. Just briefly, just enough. What crossed his face in that moment belonged only to the person experiencing it. What matters is this, a man who had not allowed himself to need anything in 43 years of living had just stood on a public street and needed something desperately, and a stranger in blue scrubs had given it to him. The paramedics took over at 8:17. By then, Sera had stabilized Renata's rhythm as best she could without proper equipment. She had positioned her correctly, monitored her breathing, and done everything her 3 years of training had equipped her to do on a cold pavement with nothing but her bag and her hands. She stood up slowly when they arrived. Her knees were stiff, her gloves were stained. Her exam folder was still on the ground where she had dropped it, the papers inside slightly scattered by the morning wind. She looked at her watch. 8:17. Her exam had started at 8 o'clock. She picked up her folder. She smoothed the papers, and then she walked, not ran because running would not save this, toward the examination hall 11 blocks away. She arrived at 8:23, 11 minutes late. Dr. Bryn Salter was waiting at the door of the practical hall. A compact woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and an expression that told Sera everything before a single word was spoken. It was not a cruel expression. That almost would have been easier. It was the expression of someone who had rehearsed this conversation and had come to terms with it before Sera had even arrived. "Miss Voss," she said, "the protocol is very clear." "I know," Sera said. "There are no exceptions. Not for illness, not for family emergencies, not for—" "I know." Sera's voice was quiet, not defeated, quiet. "There is a difference." She was still in her scrubs. Her knees were still marked from the pavement. She had not cried on the walk here, and she was not going to cry now, but the effort it was taking her not to was significant. "I came in person," Sera said, "because I didn't want you to think I simply didn't show up." Dr. Salter looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes. Not softness exactly, but the specific recognition of a woman who has spent a career evaluating people, and is currently evaluating one who is not performing anything. "There will be a supplemental examination," Salter said finally. 6 weeks. The board will need official documentation of the emergency. Sera nodded. "Go home, Miss Voss." She walked home the long way. She did not plan to walk through Calloway Street again. Her feet simply took her there, the way you return to the place where something important happened even when you know it will not look the same. It did not look the same, or rather, it looked completely normal. The scuff marks on the pavement were the only evidence that anything had occurred here at all. The black car was gone. The street had moved on entirely. Sera stood on the pavement and looked at the place where the woman had fallen. Then she walked home. She sat at her kitchen table in her stained scrubs, and she did not move for a long time. This is what doing the right thing actually looks like sometimes. Not a medal, not applause, just a young woman alone at a kitchen table paying the full price of a decision she would make again without hesitation. 3 days after Calloway Street, a package arrived at Sera's apartment. No sender name, no return address, just her name written on the front in clean, deliberate handwriting. The kind that belongs to someone who was taught to write carefully and never forgot it. Inside was a card, and beneath the card, a sealed manila envelope. Sera opened the envelope first. What she found inside stopped her completely. It was an official letter, printed on the letterhead of the most prominent private medical institution in the city, the kind of institution whose name appears on buildings, the kind whose board members get mentioned in the financial section of newspapers, not the news section. The letter confirmed in precise clinical language that a Sera Voss had responded to a cardiac emergency on Calloway Street and had performed field stabilization that, according to the attending cardiologist, directly contributed to the patient's survival. It was co-signed by 3 physicians. Sera sat very still. This letter was exactly what Dr. Salter had asked for. The documentation that would unlock her supplemental examination. The proof that what happened on Calloway Street was real and serious and worthy of the exception she needed. But here is what was keeping her still at that kitchen table. This letter had been produced in 3 days. 3 days. Documentation that would take the average person weeks to gather. Physician signatures, institutional letterhead, formal clinical language had arrived at her private home address in 72 hours. Whoever sent this did not navigate systems. They moved above them. She picked up the card. 1 line, no signature, just 2 initials. A debt is not something I carry lightly. D.V. Sera read it 4 times, not because it was complicated, but because she was trying to understand what kind of person writes something like that, and means it, and what it says about her own situation that this person has her home address and the resources of a small government. She put the card in her desk drawer. She submitted the documentation to the university the following morning. 6 weeks later, she walked into that supplemental examination, and she passed it. Distinction. Sera had no idea who DV was. She did not investigate the initials. She did not ask questions. She kept her head down, finished what she started, and earned that distinction the same way she had earned everything else in her life. completely on her own terms. But what she did not know, what she could not have known, is that DV had already done something else, something much bigger than a letter, something she was about to walk directly into. Now let me ask you something. If a powerful stranger, someone you had never met, quietly removed every obstacle standing between you and your dream and never asked for anything in return, would you be grateful or would you be afraid? Because those two feelings are about to live inside Sera Voss at the exact same time. Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and if you're not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? This story is just getting started, and I promise you, the next chapter will change everything you think you know about Dorian Vael. Her first placement was St. Caro's General Pediatric Ward. It was everything she had worked toward and nothing she had been fully prepared for. A place where the work was relentless, and the patients were small, and the emotional cost of carrying this. Much about this job showed up every single day whether you invited it or not. 3 weeks in, Sera had found her rhythm. She had a 7-year-old in room 12 who named all his IV bags and expected a full status briefing every morning. She had a night shift that ended at 6 and a coffee from the machine on the second floor that tasted like a punishment but was better than nothing. She had, in short, built a life inside this place. And then she turned a corner in the east corridor and saw him. Dorian Vael was sitting in the pediatric waiting room. No dark suits flanking him, no black car visible through the window. Just a man in a slightly wrinkled dress shirt, jacket folded across his knee, not holding a paper cup of hospital coffee with the resigned expression of someone who has tasted it before and chosen it anyway. He looked different here. On Calloway Street, he had been a force. Here, against the plastic chairs and the children's drawings taped to the walls and the gentle noise of a ward that existed entirely for small, vulnerable people, he looked like something unexpected. Human. He looked up before she reached him. He had been watching the corridor. Of course he had. "How is she?" Sera asked. "Recovering," he said. "Back in her garden by spring, they say." Sera nodded. She had rounds in 4 minutes. She should have kept walking. "Why are you here?" she asked instead. He turned the paper cup in his hands. "My nephew," he said. "Routine cardiology check." A pause that carried more weight than it should have. "I was told you were placed here." Sera looked at him steadily. "You were told," she said. "I was told," he confirmed. No apology, no deflection, no carefully constructed explanation designed to make it sound like something other than what it was. He had tracked her placement, and he was telling her so directly, placing that information between them like something he was choosing to be accountable for rather than hide. It was, by every measure, the most disarming thing he could have done. "That's unsettling," she said. "Yes," he said. Her pager buzzed. She held his gaze for 1 more second. Then she turned and walked back down the corridor toward room 12, where a 7-year-old was waiting for his morning IV bag briefing, and she did not look back. But she was aware, with the full awareness of someone standing at the edge of something they cannot yet name, that the man in the waiting room was watching her go. Nobody told Renata Vael what to do, not doctors, not bodyguards, and certainly not her son. This is important, because if you are going to understand what happens next in this story, you need to understand who Renata actually was, not as Dorian's mother, not as the woman on the pavement, but as herself. Before the townhouse and the private medical facility and the men in dark suits at her door, Renata had been a school teacher in the southern part of the city. She had made her son's lunches. She had kept a garden. She had spent 40 years believing, with the particular stubbornness of someone who has seen genuine hardship, that people were almost always more than the worst version of themselves. She knew exactly what her son had become. She had never pretended otherwise. She had simply refused to let that knowledge be the only thing she held about him. When Dorian visited her recovery room and told her the situation was handled and she needed to focus on healing, Renata listened to every word he said with the patient attention of a woman who has learned that listening completely is the most efficient way to identify exactly which parts of a conversation to ignore. She waited until he left. Then she asked for pen and paper. The letter she wrote was warm, elegant, completely ordinary on its surface. A thank you note from a woman named Renata, who wanted Sera to know she had been told what happened on Calloway Street, what it had cost, and that she would very much like to have tea, if Sera was ever willing. No last name, no address, no phone number, just one line at the bottom that Renata chose very deliberately. I suspect you are not easily frightened, but I want you to know you are not obligated. The letter arrived at St. Caro's General the following afternoon. Hand-delivered. The ward receptionist told Sera the man who brought it did not give his name. Sera read the letter twice. Then she wrote back. She said yes. What Sera did not know, and would not know for some time, was that her response never traveled directly to Renata. It passed through other hands first, and one of those hands belonged to a man who read it standing beside a window, in a room Sera had never been in, with an expression his face was not accustomed to making. The townhouse was in the quieter end of the city's historic district, the kind of street where the buildings have been standing long enough to develop opinions about the people who live in them. Sera arrived alone. She had been offered a car. She declined it. She walked the 40 minutes because walking gave her time to decide what kind of person she was going to be in that room, and she had decided somewhere around the 20-minute mark that she was going to be exactly who she always was. No performance, no careful distance, just Sera. Renata received her in a sitting room that smelled of rosemary and old books. She was smaller than Sera remembered from the pavement, or perhaps she only seemed smaller now that she was upright, animated, completely and unmistakably alive. She made the tea herself, which Sera noticed immediately. A woman with this address, this townhouse, and men in dark suits at her door, and she made her own tea. The conversation started simply. Renata asked about Sera's work, about Tobias, about why nursing. She listened the way people who have genuinely paid attention to others for a lifetime listen, not waiting for her turn, but actually receiving what was being said. Sera, who had come prepared to be gracious and brief, looked up 40 minutes later and realized she had not checked the time once. Then Renata set down her cup and said, in the same calm tone she had used to ask about Tobias, "My son owns the hospital where you work." Sera did not move. This moment deserves its full weight. Everything Sera had chosen not to examine too closely was now demanding to be examined at once. The documentation that appeared in 3 days. The placement letter that came through without friction. The letter delivered by a man with no name, D.V. Dorian Vael. Renata watched her process all of it and did not rush her, did not explain, did not soften it. Just waited the way someone waits when they respect the person across from them enough to let them arrive at the truth at their own pace. "He didn't arrange your placement," Renata said finally. "He acquired the hospital 14 months before you were ever on that street. But he made sure. Your application was not lost in the system. There is a difference." Sera looked at her steadily. "Is there?" she asked. Renata considered the question with genuine seriousness. "I have been asking myself that question about him for 30 years, she said quietly. "I haven't finished answering it." Sera walked home after that. Alone again, she declined the car again, moving through the city with everything she had just learned rearranging itself inside, her like furniture being moved in a room she thought she knew. She was 2 blocks from the townhouse when she noticed the black car, 1 block behind her. Moving at walking pace, staying exactly 1 block behind her for the entire route home, not following her, watching the perimeter around her. There is a specific moment when you realize that someone else has made a decision about your safety without asking your permission. It is not entirely comfortable. It is not entirely unwelcome. It sits somewhere in the complicated middle, which is probably exactly where Dorian Vael intended it to sit. She got home. She locked her door. She sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she had read the card with the initials DV 6 weeks ago, and she thought about a man who owns hospitals and sends cars and reads letters that were never addressed to him, and she thought about the way he had looked at her in that pediatric waiting room, like something he had not yet found the right category for. Stories travel in this city the way water travels, finding every crack, taking the shape of whatever contains them, and the story of what happened on Calloway Street had been traveling for weeks now, moving through certain circles, changing shape as it moved, arriving in places Sera Voss had no idea it was going. In a private dining room on the west side of the city, 2 men sat across a table from each other and discussed it. Their names only matter once, the Caro brothers. That is enough. What matters is not who they were, but what they did with information. which was the same thing every dangerous person does with information. They looked for the pressure point inside it. The version of the story they had received was stripped of its humanity and reduced to its strategic content. A young woman had saved Renata Vael's life. She had since been placed at a hospital Dorian owned. She had been seen meeting privately with Renata in the historic district. One brother turned his glass slowly on the table. "A woman the king owes a debt to," he said, "has value." The other brother said nothing. He didn't need to. Value in their world meant one thing: leverage. 3 nights later, Sera was sitting beside Fenn's bed at 2 a.m. Dorian's nephew had woken from a bad dream. His monitors had alarmed briefly, his heart rate spiking before settling. And now he was awake and anxious in the particular way of 6-year-olds who do not yet have the vocabulary for what they are feeling. Sera sat with him. She told him about Tobias, about the hospital corridor she had stood in as a teenager, scared and helpless, about why she had decided to become the person who knew what to do. Fenn listened with the complete attention of a child who understands somehow that a grown-up is telling them something real. Then he said, My Uncle Dorian comes every week. He always brings the same chocolate. He reads to me even though I'm old enough to read myself." Sera looked at this 6-year-old boy with a heart condition and the uncle who brought the same chocolate every week and read aloud to a child who didn't need it anymore. And something in her understanding of Dorian Vael quietly shifted. Not into something comfortable, into something more honest. She finished her shift at 6 a.m. Her neighbor, Mr. Cassell, an elderly man who watered her landing plant on night shifts, was in the hallway when she arrived home. He mentioned a car parked across the street for several hours the previous night. Dark, running. He assumed it was a rideshare. Sera stood very still on her landing. "I need you to think about what is happening here." Sera saved a stranger's life. She asked for nothing. She expected nothing. And now, without doing a single thing wrong, she has become a target in a war she didn't sign up for and barely knows exists. Does that feel fair to you? Because here is what I know about this story. Fair has never been part of the equation for Sera Voss, not once in her entire life. Tell me in the comments, should she run or should she stay and face whatever is coming? Because the next part is the moment everything changes. Dorian is about to have the most honest conversation of his life. And the person sitting across from him, the person brave enough to actually demand the truth, is Sera. If you are not subscribed yet, do it right now, because once this next part hits, you will not want to be catching up. She called the number the following morning. Not because she was afraid, though she was, but because Sera Voss had never in her life dealt with something by pretending it wasn't there. She left 4 words on the administrative contact line listed under St. Caro's ownership structure in Penwood, the structure she had quietly researched the night before. "I need to talk." He was at the hospital within the hour. Dorian was standing at the window outside the pediatric ward when she found him, watching Fenn sleep with the monitors beeping their quiet reassurances. He did not turn when she approached. He already knew she was there. Sera stopped beside him. She did not ease into it. "Someone was watching my building," she said. "I know." "Was it your people?" A pause. One single beat of silence that contained more information than a full sentence. "No," he said. Sera understood what that one word contained. Not just an answer, an admission. There were people in this city who had identified her connection to Dorian, and those people had interests that ran directly against his. And she, a nursing student from Fenwick Road who ate ramen and worked laundry shifts and just wanted to wear a white coat, was now visible inside that conflict. Because she stopped on Calloway Street, because she chose a stranger's life over her own future. Dorian turned from the window. He looked at her directly. Not the way he had on Calloway Street, not the controlled fury of a man whose rules were being broken. Something quieter than that, something that cost him more. He told her enough, not everything. Dorian Vael has probably never told anyone everything, but enough. There were people watching her. The connection to his mother had made her visible in a world where visibility was not safe. She had 3 options. She could leave St. Caro's for a public hospital placement where her connection to the Vael name became diluted and distant. She could stay and accept a level of protection she would not always see but would always have. Or she could do nothing and decide the car outside her building was a coincidence. Sera looked at him for a long, steady moment. "What would you do?" she asked. He answered without hesitation. "I would stay, but I make terrible decisions about what things are worth." "I'll stay," she said. Something moved through Dorian's expression. Not relief exactly. More like the specific feeling of a man who wanted a particular answer and is now accountable for having wanted it. He walked back down the corridor. Crest fell into step beside him immediately. The bodyguard's face carrying the look of someone delivering news he had been holding until the right moment. The Caro brothers had identified Sera's home address. Dorian stopped walking. 3 seconds of complete stillness. Then he gave 3 quiet instructions that don't belong in the open. What matters is what happened next. By the time Sera finished her shift that evening and walked home, through the city, there were 4 people she had never met and would never see, positioned at 4 points around her life. Making sure it continued, everything you thought you knew about Calloway Street is about to change. Because here is what nobody told you. Renata Vael knew, not about the cardiac event. Nobody warns you about your own heart. But 6 weeks before she collapsed on that pavement, Renata had received a message from an old woman named Petra. A woman who had known Renata since before either of their sons became what they became. A woman with eyes inside the Caro organization who sent word, quietly and carefully, that the brothers were preparing something against Dorian. Not against his empire, against his exposure, his mother. Renata had read that message at her kitchen table, the same table where she made her own tea and wrote her own letters, and refused every single day to become the fragile thing her son's protection was slowly turning her into, and she had made a decision. She did not tell Dorian. This deserves its full weight. This woman who loved her son more completely than he would ever allow himself to believe, received a direct warning about a threat to her own safety, and she chose silence. Not because she was reckless, because she was exhausted. 30 years of watching Dorian build walls around her until the walls themselves became the problem. 30 years of guards at the door and cars waiting outside, and every ordinary hour of her life requiring negotiation and permission. She had decided, with the quiet finality of a woman who has made peace with her own mortality, that she would not spend whatever time remained to her, being managed like an asset. She dismissed her morning guard on the day of Calloway Street deliberately. She took the walk she had been told not to take. She accepted the risk. Her heart made its own separate decision that morning. That part was not strategy. That part simply happened. What Dorian did not know, what he learned only now, 6 months later, from an investigator's report sitting in a folder on his lap, was that his mother had moved first, before the package arrived at Sera's apartment, before the physician's signatures, before any of it. Renata had contacted the University Examination Board through a channel so removed from her own name that it appeared to originate from a medical ethics foundation. She had ensured, quietly, completely, without leaving a visible fingerprint, that the supplemental examination option was formally protected and available before Dorian's documentation even arrived. His package had confirmed what Renata had already secured. He sat outside her garden in his car and read the full report twice. Then he closed the folder. Through the gate he could see her, on her knees in the garden bed, hands deep in the earth, completely unbothered by the world's opinion of her choices. The cardiologist had said she would be back in her garden by spring. The cardiologist had, for once, been exactly right. Dorian stood at the gate for a long time. He did not go in. He understood something in that moment that he had spent 43 years organizing his entire existence to avoid understanding. The person he had protected most fiercely had always been several steps ahead of him and had been protecting him back. He closed the gate quietly, walked back to his car, sat down. Crest handed him a second report without a word. The Caro brothers had placed someone inside St. Caro's General, someone on staff. The someone on staff was not who you would expect, and that is exactly what made it so devastating. Dr. Harwell Pruitt had been at St. Caro's General for 19 years, senior physician, respected, the kind of doctor who remembered patients' names between visits, and kept a bowl of wrapped candies on his desk for the children who came to his floor by mistake and needed a reason to stop crying. He had mentored Sera. Through her first difficult case 3 weeks into her placement, A 7-year-old with a fever that wouldn't break and parents in the corridor who needed someone to speak to them with honesty and patience. Pruitt had stood beside Sera and shown her how. He had brought her coffee without being asked on the night. Fenn's monitors alarmed at 3 in the morning. He was not a villain. That is the part you need to hold on to. Sera noticed it on a Tuesday evening, the end of a double shift, her body running on its last reserves. Fenn's routine cardiology notes, kept in the ward's physical file system per Dorian's private security requirements, had been moved. Not taken, moved. Replaced in the folder at a slightly different angle, the pages sitting wrong in the way that only someone who filed them originally would detect. She checked the ward access log. One name appeared during the relevant window, Dr. Harwell Pruitt. Sera sat with that information for a long time before she moved. She found him in the staff room at the end of her shift, tired, quiet, nursing the same cold coffee he always had at this hour. She did not accuse him. She was not certain enough for accusation, and she was too tired for performance. She simply asked, carefully and without visible weight, whether anything unusual had been happening on the ward. His answer came too fast, too casual, too perfectly composed for a man who was genuinely unbothered. Sera heard everything inside that answer. She went home. She did not sleep. Here is what Sera did not know yet about Dr. Harwell Pruitt. A gambling debt, several years old, had been quietly purchased by the Caro brothers and held in reserve for exactly this kind of moment. Pruitt was not a corrupt man who had chosen corruption freely. He was a frightened man who had borrowed from the wrong people a long time ago and had never fully escaped the interest. The Caros had not recruited him. They had activated him. There is a difference. It does not make what he did forgivable, but it makes it human. And understanding why people fail is more useful than simply deciding they are bad. Sera left a 4-word message on Dorian's contact line that morning. I need to talk. This time, she did not have to wait long. It happened on a Tuesday night at 11:40. Sera left St. Caro's after a double shift, exhausted, running on muscle memory and the specific determination of someone who has always finished what they started. She had spoken with Dorian earlier that day. A brief conversation, tightly controlled. He confirmed what she suspected about Pruitt, told her the situation was being handled, told her to take the car he was sending. She declined the car, one more time, one last time, because accepting that car meant accepting everything it represented. The protection, the surveillance, the quiet acknowledgement that her life no longer belonged entirely to her own decisions. And Sera Voss had spent 24 years building a life on her own terms. She was not ready to hand that over, not yet. She was 2 streets from her apartment when she noticed it. The footsteps behind her had maintained exactly the same distance for 4 blocks. Not gaining, not falling back, just there. Fear doesn't need dramatizing. If you've ever walked alone at night and heard footsteps that shouldn't be there, you already know what it feels like. It lives in your shoulders, in the way your breathing changes, in the sudden awareness of every doorway and every dark window and every place you could run if running became necessary. Sera's hand tightened on her bag strap. Her training, not medical training, but the older training of a woman who grew up without safety nets, told her to change direction, cross the street, put light between herself and whatever was behind her. She turned. 2 men, not the Caro brothers themselves. The Caro brothers probably haven't personally delivered a message in a decade, but their representatives, their instruments. What happened next took under 90 seconds. One of the men reached for her bag. Sera backed against a wall, not out of panic, but out of physics, putting something solid at her spine. A shout came from the far end of the street, a voice she did not recognize, giving a command she did not fully hear. And then from the darkness of an adjacent doorway, a figure that had been there the entire time, Crest. And behind Crest, 2 others, and a black car already turning into the street with its headlights cutting through the night like something definitive. The 2 men withdrew. They did not run. Running would have conceded the encounter too completely, but they walked away, quickly, deliberately, with the particular awareness of people who understand they have just miscalculated badly. Dorian got out of the car. He walked to where Sera stood against the wall, coat still pressed to the brick, breathing controlled but not quite. Steady. And he stopped in front of her. did not ask if she was all right. He could see she was all right. But for the first time since Calloway Street, Dorian Vael looked not furious. He looked afraid. Not for himself, never for himself. For the distance between what almost happened and what actually happened. "You declined the car," he said. "I know," she said. Sera." It was the first time he had used her name. Some moments do not need commentary, they simply need to exist. She got in the car, she looked out the window as the city passed, the same city she had walked through alone 1,000 times, now somehow different. After a long silence, she asked the question she already knew the answer to. "How long were your people outside my building?" Dorian did not hesitate. "Since the morning after you had tea with my mother." She did not respond immediately. She did not ask him to stop. She did not argue. She simply sat with the information, processing what it meant that someone had been watching over her for weeks without her knowledge or permission. Protection she never asked for. Safety she could not refuse. The Caro situation was resolved, but not the way you think. Dorian did not retaliate. He did not meet violence with violence. This reveals more about who Dorian Vael actually is than any dramatic confrontation ever could. He leveraged. The gambling debt that had given the Caro brothers their hold on Dr. Pruitt was acquired through a financial channel so clean it left no fingerprints. Purchased quietly. Then, and this is the part that matters, forgiven entirely, publicly, through a legal instrument that closed the debt permanently and removed the Caro's access to Pruitt as leverage forever. Without their inside position at St. Caro's, the Caros lost their angle on Sera. Without their angle on Sera, they lost their pressure point against Dorian. The entire structure collapsed not with a confrontation but with paperwork. Pruitt was transferred, at his own request, to a different facility. He left a letter for Sera, handwritten, unsealed, left at the ward desk where anyone could have read it but no one did. It did not excuse what he had done, it explained it, which is different. Sera read it once, folded it carefully, kept it. Because she had learned something important in the last 6 months, that understanding why people fail is more useful than pretending betrayal is simple. The real resolution took place in Renata's garden. Renata had invited both of them separately, telling neither that the other would be there, because Renata Vael had never had patience for the time people waste circling what they actually mean. They arrived within minutes of each other. Found her on her knees in the garden bed, hands deep in the soil, entirely unbothered by the expressions on their faces. She made them sit, she made them tea, and then she said, with the directness of a woman who has carried enough secrets for long enough, "I dismissed my guard that morning because I was tired of being managed. My heart had other ideas. This girl kept me alive, and you," she looked at Dorian, "have spent 6 months protecting her from consequences instead of simply thanking her." Dorian said nothing. "Thank her," Renata said. The silence that followed was the longest in the entire story so far. Dorian looked at Sera, not with the expression of a man following instructions, but with the expression of a man who has been waiting for permission to say something true. "You cost me every assumption I had about what a person could be," he said quietly. "I don't know how to repay that." Sera looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Renata. Then she picked up her tea. "Stop owning hospitals where I work," she said. "That would be a start." Renata laughed. It was the first time in this entire exchange anyone had laughed. The specific laughter of a woman who has been waiting a very long time for the people she loves to stop being so exhausting. As Sera walked out through the garden, Dorian fell into step beside her. She glanced at him. "You're walking me out?" "It's a garden," he said. "It ends in about 8 steps. She almost smiled. That almost smile is somehow the most significant thing that has happened in this entire story. 6 months after Calloway Street, Tobias, Sera's younger brother, Sawiritz, was enrolled in a specialist cardiac monitoring program at a private pediatric clinic. The referral came through standard hospital pathways. Sera requested it. It was approved without obstruction. Worth noting, without making anything of it. The clinic's research funding had been restructured 8 months prior by a private philanthropic instrument with the initials DV. Cities are full of coincidences. Fenn was doing better. His last cardiology review showed improvement his consultant described as meaningful. He still named things. his monitors, his blankets, the window in his room that caught afternoon light. He had named that window Sarah. She learned this from another nurse and chose never to mention it to Dorian because some things were better left uncomplicated. Dr. Bryn Salter submitted a proposal to the university board, an amendment to emergency protocol for practical examinations. Field emergency response would now qualify as documented grounds for postponement. She cited no specific case. She did not need to. Renata was in her garden every morning. She had planted a new raised bed along the south wall. Patient, long-season things that would not produce anything for 2 years. She was 71 years old and planting for a future she had decided would cooperate. Sera and Dorian were walking through the older district. Not Calloway Street, neither had suggested that, and this unspoken agreement meant something. Just walking. The way people walk when destination is not the point. Sera stopped in front of a red brick building, looked up at it for no reason she could name. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. It just looks like something." He looked up at the building, looked back at her. "Most things do," he said, "if you stop long enough." They kept walking. This story closes not with an ending, but with an orientation. The particular feeling of standing at the beginning of something large, something not fully visible yet, something that began on a cold pavement when a young woman in blue scrubs dropped her exam folder and ran toward a stranger. She went there to save a life. She did not expect to find one. Sera Voss walked onto Calloway Street with everything to lose, and chose a stranger's life over her own future. Dorian Vael built an empire on control, and met the one person he couldn't manage. And Renata? Well, Renata knew exactly what she was doing from the beginning. She always does. If this story found something in you, something real, leave it in the comments. Tell me what stayed with you. Tell me if you would have stopped on that pavement. Tell me if you think Sera made the right choice. Because here is what I know. The right choice is almost never the easy one. And the people worth knowing are the ones who make it anyway. This is Mafia Romance Cinematic. I tell stories about love and power and the complicated space where they meet. If you want more, if you want to know what happens when Dorian's past doesn't stay as quiet as the Caro situation did, when something older and far more personal comes back to test everything that has quietly been building between these two, Part 2 is already waiting. Hit that subscribe button, check the playlist on screen, and I will see you in the next one.